Adolescents now have to worry that they might get shot at school due to the current epidemic of school shootings here in the United States. Here are some of the causes for these school shootings. The first is the immature adolescent brain, which we have already discussed in great detail earlier in our class. But remember, because the adolescent brain is not fully developed, this often leads to poor decision making and impulsive behavior. Next is easy access to guns and the fact that our society has been flooded with guns. Next, the romanticization of gun culture by the media also plays a role. Next, gang presence in schools is another cause. Next, psychologically unhealthy home environments contribute to these school shootings. And lastly, exposure to media violence is thought to be a cause for these school shootings. I would like to show you some data. Now, this table shows the estimated number of guns owned by law enforcement and military versus civilians in the United States. Now, each gun icon represents 1 million guns. So, law enforcement and military in the United States, they possess 4 million guns. And there's a little asterisk, and they clarify that 1 million law enforcement weapons, and then it's 3 million military weapons. So at any rate, law enforcement and military, they possess 4 million guns, compared with 310 million guns owned by civilians. So this illustration clearly demonstrates that it is not an exaggeration that our society has been flooded with guns. Here's some more data to take a look at. This is an epidemiological study which looks at the rate of gun ownership in various states in the United States versus the amount of people who have died from gun deaths in that state. So right away you can see a clear pattern that there's a clear diagonal incline going upwards. So that indicates that there's a correlation or a relationship between gun ownership versus gun deaths. So you can see that there's a clear pattern that the states that have the most guns also have the most gun deaths to go along with that. So at the top, we have Alaska. They have the highest rate of gun ownership, and it really shouldn't be surprising that they have the highest rate of gun deaths to go along with it. What other states are near the top? Alabama, Wyoming, Arkansas, Idaho, and etc. Down at the low end, we can see, for example, Rhode Island has one of the lowest rates of gun ownership, and so they have a low rate of gun deaths to go along with it. So, whoops, also New York, New Jersey, etc. But clearly this data shows that the more guns that a particular state has, then the more gun deaths they also have to go along with it, and it's demonstrated clearly by this hard quantitative data. Now, it's a myth that violent video games deserve more blame than guns. So that's something that you'll often hear gun defenders say. They'll say that it's not the guns, it's the violent video games. That's the reason why we have these school shootings. Well, let's take a look at this data. So in the United States, this data is from 2011. The United States spent $44 per capita spending on video games. Japan, 55, so they spend more on video games. In the United States, per 100 people, there are 88 firearms per 100 people. In Japan, less than 1, 6/10. Now let's look at the annual gun homicides between the two countries. In 2011, the United States had 11,000 gun homicides. Compare that with Japan, 6, a minuscule amount. And even when you control for population, you can see population of Japan at that time was 128 million versus the US population of 312 million. And you can see that this is a significant difference. Now, if violent video games were to blame, then logically you would expect Japan to also have a high amount of gun deaths, but they don't. So clearly that is not accurate. Now, I'm not saying that violent video games don't play a role in terms of these school shootings. They are a piece of the puzzle, but what's the bigger factor? The bigger factor is clearly easy access to guns. Now, another thing that gun advocates like to do is they like to frame it not as an access to gun issue, but as a mental health issue. And they like to say that it's not, the fact that our society has been completely oversaturated with guns. It's that we have a mental health issue. So what did the American Psychological Association president say regarding this? So, of course, mental health is our field, psychology, and here is what she said. Routinely blaming mass shootings on mental illness is unfounded and stigmatizing. Research has shown that only a very small percentage of violent acts are committed by people who are diagnosed with or in treatment for mental illness. And then she also said, the rates of mental illness are roughly the same around the world, yet other countries are not experiencing these traumatic events as often as we face them. One critical factor is access to and the lethality of the weapons that are being used in these crimes. Adding racism, intolerance, and bigotry to the mix is a recipe for disaster. The American Psychiatric Association also issued a statement in response to these mass shootings, and here's what they said. The overwhelming majority of people with mental illness are not violent and far more likely to be victims of violent crime than perpetrators of violence. Rhetoric that argues otherwise will further stigmatize and interfere with people accessing needed treatment. Individuals can also be emboldened to act violently by the public discourse and divisive rhetoric. So the experts on mental health say that framing the mass shooting epidemics as a mental health issue is inaccurate and unhelpful and even dangerous to our society. So how can we prevent these school shootings? So we can have school-based programs for all children that teach conflict resolution, promote social skills, and teach emotional awareness and control. And then probably the biggest thing that we can do is simply reduce easy access to guns, and that will make a big difference in reducing these horrific school shootings.